I really want to talk to the person who puts the words into the teleprompter, because this is like a Ron Burgundy situation. Like every time he says affordability is a hoax,
will the gentleman yield?
In a second, let me do this and then I will yield. But like every time he says affordability is a hoax, I mean, it's like saying go F yourself, San Diego, okay? Or is it San Diego? You know, scholars say the translation was lost long ago. I don't, like there's no partisanship on the grocery store bill. I know what you're saying, Jared. Be honest, tell the other side of the coin, okay, gasoline prices are down, right? See, I'm being fair. Gasoline prices are down, and that's great. Getting energy prices down is important. But, you know, they're not as down as much as he's projecting. But the problem is you can't eat gasoline, right? Can't eat gasoline.
You know what absolutely detonates my capacity for measured discourse is watching Jared Moskowitz eviscerate the entire gaslighting apparatus of Trumpism with nothing more than a Ron Burgundy reference and the devastating weapon of empirical reality, because right here in this clip we are witnessing something far more profound than a mere congressional floor speech. We are watching the complete and utter collapse of the conservative economic narrative that has sustained Republican electoral viability for the past year. And let me tell you something that should send shivers down the spine of every MAGA operative from Mar-a-Lago to Mount Pocono. Trump literally stood before supporters in Pennsylvania and declared that the term affordability itself was a hoax perpetrated by Democrats, which represents such a staggering departure from material reality that it would be comedic if it weren't so catastrophically cruel to the millions of Americans drowning in grocery bills that have increased by margins that would make robber barons blush with shame. The sheer audacity of this moment cannot be overstated, because we need to understand the philosophical violence being committed here. And I want you to feel the weight of what Moskowitz is articulating when he says there's just no partisanship on the grocery store bill, because he is dismantling the foundational myth that authoritarian movements depend upon, which is the idea that you can simply tell people that their lived experiences are fabrications, that the pain they feel reaching for their wallets is somehow a Democratic Party conspiracy, rather than the consequence of systemic policy choices that have enriched corporate shareholders while immiserating working families. The typical U.S. household must now spend $208 more each month than they did in September 2024 to buy the same goods and services, which amounts to nearly $2,500 in increased annual costs for the same groceries, the same electricity, the same childcare, and yet we have a president who campaigns on economic populism only to govern like Marie Antoinette, telling peasants that bread shortages are fake news. What Moskowitz understands with crystalline clarity, and what makes this intervention so intellectually devastating, is that Trump has trapped himself in an epistemological prison of his own construction, because listen to the contradiction embedded in the conservative position right now. Trump himself declared after the election, "I won on the border and I won on groceries," and acknowledged that when you buy apples, when you buy bacon, when you buy eggs, they would double and triple the price over a short period of time, and I won an election based on that. So he explicitly ran on the affordability crisis. He weaponized people's economic suffering to win power, and now that he occupies the Oval Office, he has the unmitigated gall to declare that the very crisis he exploited doesn't actually exist. This is not political hypocrisy. This is gaslighting as statecraft. This is the authoritarian playbook, where reality itself becomes infinitely malleable depending on what serves power in any given moment. And the empirical devastation just keeps mounting, because Trump's assertions dismissing inflation are not backed by official government economic data, and many voters are questioning how well Trump is tackling stubbornly high costs, with 57% saying in a Harvard Capps-Harris poll that Trump was losing the battle against inflation, while pollster Frank Luntz warns that Trump risks appearing out of touch when he claims affordability is a hoax, as Americans actually do pay more. We are witnessing the political consequences of denying material reality in real time, as Democrats won the Miami mayor's race for the first time in nearly 30 years by 18 points just hours after Trump's Pennsylvania speech, dismissing affordability concerns, which should send alarm bells ringing through every Republican campaign office, because voters are rejecting this fantasy economics with the only power they possess, the ballot. The philosophical stakes here connect to deeper traditions of progressive thought, going back to the Enlightenment principle that reason and evidence must guide governance, that we cannot simply construct alternative realities to serve political convenience, and when Moskowitz invokes the Ron Burgundy Anchorman reference, saying Trump will read anything on that teleprompter, He is making a sophisticated argument about the performative nature of Trumpian politics, the idea that there is no coherent ideology or genuine concern for working families, only the recitation of whatever words appear before him, regardless of their relationship to truth or consistency. This echoes Hannah Arendt's warnings about totalitarian movements and their assault on objective reality, their insistence that facts themselves are merely tools of political enemies rather than the foundation upon which democratic deliberation must rest. Now let us examine the economic policies that have produced this crisis. Because Trump has embraced tariffs that force prices upward, with import taxes raising about $30 billion per month in revenue, while increasing prices on items from food to clothing to furniture, which means his signature economic policy is actively contributing to the affordability crisis he claims doesn't exist. As of November, prices were nearly 6% higher than pre-tariff trends, with some categories experiencing massive increases including clothing and footwear, up 15.9%, and coffee and tea up 9.2%. So when Moskowitz says you can't eat gasoline, he is highlighting the cruel mathematical reality that even if energy prices decline slightly, families cannot fuel themselves or their children with petroleum products. They need food and shelter and health care, and all of those necessities have become crushingly more expensive. The grocery data alone should radicalize anyone with a functioning moral compass, because food prices in the United States rose by 3.1% in the 12 months ending September 2025. Food-at-home prices rose at an annual rate of 2.7% in August, the fastest pace of grocery inflation in 2 years, now at the highest rate since August 2023, while since December 2019 food prices have risen 29.5%, leading to consumer frustration with prices and affordability. This is not some abstract economic indicator. This is parents standing in grocery store aisles making impossible choices about whether they can afford protein this week. This is seniors on fixed incomes cutting pills in half because they cannot simultaneously pay for medication and meals. This is the material suffering that Trump dismisses as a Democratic hoax while economists warn his policies will make everything worse. And here is where the intersectionality of this crisis becomes absolutely crucial, because roughly 14% of U.S. households reported food insecurity on average between January and October 2025, up from 12.5% in 2024, and in New York City, 40% of local families cannot afford their weekly food costs, which means we are not talking about people who want cheaper avocado toast. We are talking about families who cannot consistently feed their children in the wealthiest nation in human history. This is a moral catastrophe. This is a policy choice. And when Moskowitz stands on the House floor and refuses to let Republicans pretend this away, he is performing the essential democratic function of bearing witness to suffering that power would prefer to ignore. The healthcare dimension adds another layer of devastation because the government shutdown ended without extending tax credits for health insurance, which means low- and middle-income households will likely see their ACA premiums rise from an average of $888 in 2025 to $1,904 in 2026. Do you understand what this means? Do you grasp the human consequences of that 1,016 monthly increase for families already stretched to breaking, families who might now have to choose between health insurance and rent, between medication and food, between bankruptcy and death? This is violence. This is structural violence perpetrated through policy, and the Republican response is to call the affordability crisis a hoax, while Democrats like Moskowitz and the Lowering Cost Caucus push back, declaring the affordability crisis is real, and it is crippling the American dream. The utility costs represent yet another front in this war on working families, because Americans now pay an average of $265 per month in utility costs, up 12% since last year, as electricity demand outstrips supply, with more than 124 million Americans expected to see energy bill rate increases in 2025. And here is the cruel mathematics of inequality embedded in this crisis, because low and middle income families spend between 6 and 10% of their income on energy, 3 to 5 times that of higher income household, which means the affordability crisis functions as a regressive tax on poverty itself, extracting proportionally more from those who have the least, while the wealthy barely notice the difference in their monthly statements. Now let me connect this to the broader narrative of Trumpian deception, because voters blame Trump for the current economy more than Biden, by 62% according to a Fox News poll, and they actually blame Trump more than they ever blamed Biden in real time, when he was president. This is the polling data that should terrify every Republican strategist, because Trump's approach basically boils down to convincing large numbers of Americans that their current views are wrong, which is perhaps the most politically suicidal strategy imaginable in a democracy where voters ultimately decide what constitutes their own material interests. You cannot gaslight your way out of grocery bills. You cannot tweet away the reality of empty bank accounts. Trump complained from the stage that if he read what was on the teleprompter, people would fall asleep, and then called concerns about affordability a hoax, while reprising claims that voters' worries about rising costs were a political ploy manufactured by Democrats. The tariff trap that Trump has constructed for himself reveals the intellectual bankruptcy of contemporary conservative economics, because tariffs levied by the Trump administration have increased prices on numerous items from food to clothing to furniture, while pursuing policies that purposefully restrict supply, which basic economics courses teach will push up prices. This is not some exotic economic theory. This is Econ 101, supply and demand, the foundational principles that every undergraduate learns. And yet we have an administration that simultaneously complains about affordability while implementing the exact policies guaranteed to make everything more expensive. Tariffs are contributing to higher prices for imported staples like bananas and coffee, with coffee prices jumping more than 20% in the last year, due partly to weather but also Trump's double-digit import taxes. So when working families reach for their morning coffee, they are literally paying the Trump tax. And we must discuss the profound betrayal embedded in this political moment. Because Trump ran explicitly as an economic populist, he held up Tic Tacs at rallies to illustrate shrinkflation. Fuck-a-mode, he declared inflation is destroying our country, and promised to target everything from car affordability to housing affordability to insurance costs, pledging to deliver results within the first 100 days, and proclaiming starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again. Those were the promises, that was the contract with voters. And the reality has been the overall cost of groceries is higher now than when Trump was sworn in, while he pursued mass deportations, remaking the federal government and implementing right-wing ideology that blames societal ills on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, rather than actually addressing the economic desperation that won him the election. The housing crisis compounds this nightmare because housing costs have surged, with rents increasing an average of 24% over the past 4 years, and inflation-adjusted house prices rose 65% from 2000 to 2020, far outpacing wage growth, which means younger Americans face the prospect of permanent renter status, locked out of homeownership and wealth accumulation in ways that fundamentally alter the intergenerational social contract. This is not just an economic issue. This is a civilizational crisis. This is the collapse of the American dream mythology that has sustained social cohesion for generations, and when combined with unaffordable healthcare, crushing student debt, stagnant wages, and now grocery inflation, you have created conditions where people cannot afford to exist, where the basic requirements of survival consume every dollar and leave nothing for building a future. The childcare dimension reveals how this crisis particularly devastates women and families, because the Economic Policy Institute found that childcare costs now exceed college tuition in 38 states and the District of Columbia, which creates impossible binds where parents, predominantly mothers, must choose between staying in the workforce and paying more for childcare than they earn, or exiting the labor market entirely and sacrificing career advancement, retirement security, and economic independence. This is how patriarchy perpetuates itself through economic policy. This is structural oppression disguised as market outcomes, and any progressive analysis must recognize that the affordability crisis hits hardest at the intersections of class, gender, and race. What makes Moskowitz's intervention so powerful is that he refuses the false equivalence. He rejects the both sides of that has paralyzed so much political discourse, and when he says can't eat gasoline unless of course Kennedy proposed that, with that wry dig at RFK Jr., he is modeling the kind of righteous mockery that progressives need to deploy more aggressively, because authoritarianism withers under laughter. It cannot survive sustained ridicule of its inherent absurdities. The comparison to Ron Burgundy reading Go Fuck Yourself, San Diego is brilliant because it captures something essential about Trump's relationship to language and meaning, the way he performs presidency without understanding governance, reciting words without comprehending consequences, living entirely in the realm of spectacle, while real people suffer real deprivation. And we must connect this to the systematic dismantling of the social safety net, because Trump administration tariffs are raising costs across the board, while federal support for healthcare costs evaporates and Congress eviscerates social support programs like Medicaid and food stamps. This is class warfare. This is the deliberate impoverishment of working people to fund tax cuts for billionaires and corporations, and the ideological through line connects Reagan's welfare queen mythology to Trump's affordability hoax gaslighting, because both represent elite attempts to deny the reality of economic suffering while blaming victims for their own immiseration. The conservative movement has spent 50 years constructing an alternative reality where poverty results from personal moral failure, rather than policy choices, where systemic inequality represents natural market outcomes rather than power exercising itself, and Trump's hoax rhetoric is simply the latest iteration of that ongoing epistemological crime. The Federal Reserve dynamics add another fascinating layer, because the root cause of Americans feeling financial pinch is dramatically higher prices from the 2022-2023 inflation crisis that consumers haven't adjusted to, with the solution being to lower interest rates to stimulate job markets and help paychecks grow. As Fed Chair Powell acknowledged, we are going to need to have some years where real compensation is higher for people to start feeling good about the affordability issue. This is Jerome Powell, Trump's own Fed chair appointee, essentially validating the Democratic position that affordability is real and requires sustained policy intervention, which means Trump cannot even get his own economic officials to support his fantasy economics. The political consequences are already manifesting because the Miami and Georgia results are merely the latest ominous signs for the GOP electoral picture, with Democrats flipping suburban Roswell's mayorship and winning their first non-federal statewide offices in Georgia in nearly 20 years during regularly scheduled 2025 elections that made the typical midterm picture look worse. These are not random fluctuations. These are voters rejecting Republican governance in real time as they experience the gap between campaign promises and governing reality. And if progressives have any political instincts whatsoever, they will hammer this affordability message relentlessly, because Trump's messaging about a strong economy is at odds with widespread voter sentiment that he's not doing enough to tackle rising costs, and that disjunction creates massive opportunities for Democratic gains. We need to understand that what Moskowitz is doing here represents a model for progressive political communication, because he is grounding moral arguments in empirical evidence, he is refusing to let conservatives control the narrative frame, and he is using humor and cultural references to make economic policy accessible and emotionally resonant. This is how you build popular consciousness. This is how you move people from isolated individual suffering to collective political understanding. And when he stands on the House floor and says you can't eat gasoline, he is performing political education, teaching Americans that their struggles are not personal failures, but systemic outcomes that policy can address. The road forward requires sustained mobilization around economic justice, because affordability has escalated from a kitchen table concern into a national crisis following years of persistently high inflation and widening wealth gaps. But while plenty is heard about the affordability problem, there seems to be very little discussion about tangible solutions. This is where progressive movements must intervene with comprehensive policy platforms that address housing, healthcare, childcare, food security, education costs, and wage stagnation simultaneously, because these are not separate issues, they are manifestations of the same underlying reality, which is that capital has captured the economy, and government has abandoned its obligation to ensure that people can afford to live with dignity. The solutions exist, and progressives need to champion them loudly and unapologetically. We need Medicare for all to eliminate health insurance premiums and medical bankruptcy. We need universal childcare so parents can work without paying poverty wages to care for their children. We need massive public housing investment to break the landlord stranglehold on shelter. We need higher minimum wages indexed to inflation and strengthened collective bargaining rights. We need progressive taxation that actually redistributes wealth downward rather than concentrating it among billionaires. We need antitrust enforcement that breaks up monopolies driving price gouging. We need financial transaction taxes and wealth taxes and corporate accountability mechanisms. These are not radical ideas. These are basic social democratic policies that every other advanced economy has implemented to varying degrees, and the only reason they seem impossible in America is because of sustained elite resistance backed by corporate media and purchased politicians. What this moment demands from progressives is moral clarity and political courage, because when Trump calls affordability a hoax while families skip meals and ration medication, that requires not thoughtful bipartisan compromise, but fierce denunciation and relentless opposition. We cannot meet fascist gaslighting with weak technocratic policy papers. We need the kind of righteous anger that Moskowitz channels. We need to make Republicans own every grocery bill, every healthcare bankruptcy, every family choosing between rent and food, because these outcomes are not accidents. They are the inevitable consequences of an economic system designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. And let us be absolutely clear about the stakes, because there is an opportunity to put policies in place not just about surviving the latest economic crisis, but building a stable, inclusive economy that works for all households. And the choices made now will determine whether the United States remains a nation of broad opportunity or becomes one where economic security is increasingly out of reach. This is the inflection point. This is the moment where we either rebuild the social contract with policies that guarantee economic security as a right rather than a privilege, or we descend further into oligarchy where survival itself requires wealth. So when you watch Jared Moskowitz eviscerate Trump's affordability hoax with nothing but facts and a pop culture reference, understand that you are witnessing something essential to democratic resistance. You are seeing someone refuse to accept the alternative reality that authoritarianism requires. You are watching empiricism deployed as a weapon against power. This is the fight, this is the work, and every single person who cares about justice needs to amplify this message until Trump cannot escape it, until every Republican candidate must answer for their complicity in this crisis, until the gap between their promises and their governance becomes so undeniable that voters sweep them from power and demand the transformational change that this moment absolutely requires. The affordability crisis is real, the suffering is real, and the political reckoning must be real, or democracy itself becomes the ultimate hoax.